Hi, everyone. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit of an awkward pause. I didn't know if I was on screen. I hope everybody is having a great day. We're about to have a better day because we are about to play a voting game show, which is a sentence I'm very excited to say out loud. So I would like to introduce our fabulous panelists and question providers. They are Paul Gronke, who is a political science professor at Reed College, and Michael Miller, who is also a political science professor at Barnard College, and then Maurice Turner, who is at Securing Democracy. And they have been providing our questions and our expert testimony for my benefit so that I can create a very complicated quiz for you all. So this is how this is going to work. So we've got 10 questions, and our fabulous technological host, Carrie, will be putting the link to that Google Doc into the chat right now. So you can click on that. It's going to ask you to sign in. Please provide us with an accurate email address, because if you are one of the finalists that will be participating in our lightning round questions later, you will get the link to that email. So it's going to need to be an email that you have easy access to. You have 10 minutes to do the question, the question and answer. Please don't cheat. Obviously, we have no ability to know if you're Googling things, but 5 minutes isn't a lot of time. And please don't work in groups, although we can't prevent you from doing that. So, go with God. All right. So we have got the link in the Google form, or the Google form link in the chat. 5 minutes is going to start right now. So get clicking and get quizzing. All right, everyone, 1 minute until the quiz is over. We have winners. All right. Our 3 people moving to the lightning round at the end of this event are going to be Dave from Washington, D.C., Spencer from New York City, and Dale from Duluth, Minnesota. You are going to get once we conclude the discussion, you'll get an email directly to the emails that you provided in the quiz for your lightning round, and I will let you guys know when those have landed on your inbox. But for now, let's go over the correct answers to the quiz that we just asked you. So we're going to show you all the right answers, and then we will talk more deeply about the 3 that most of you got wrong. So, all right, Carrie, you ready to flash those answers up on the screen? By the way, I'm drinking a glass of wine. I hope that you're drinking a glass of wine. I know Michael is drinking a beer. I think the other 2 panelists are drinking water because they're responsible, but I'm not. So here we are. Okay, quiz answer key. Answer 1. Under Georgia's new law, each county is limited to providing 1 drop box for how many active registered voters? The answer was 100,000. Quite a lot of you got that right. The second one, almost none of you got right. So we will be discussing that with our panelists, which is the closest to the typical cost of a single Diebold AccuVote TS electronic voting machine. Those have been in use for quite a long time, and somehow they still cost $3,000. All right. Okay, which state has led the nation in turnout in every presidential election since 2000? It is no wonder that Dale from Duluth, Minnesota got this right, because it is Minnesota. And during the 2018 midterm election, there were 3 states that mailed ballots to all voters, regardless of whether or not they requested one. All right. We've got more than 10 major voting laws that Congress has passed since 1990. This question was a little tricky because, what's a major voting law? But we're going to discuss that one too, so you'll find out. How many manufacturers have voting systems certified under Voluntary Voting System Guidelines VVSG 1.1? It is none. And this was not one that you guys got wrong, but we're going to discuss it just a little bit in just because I want to. So look forward to that. All right, keep going. And in 1926, this is one of the questions that we will be discussing. This is my favorite fun fact about American voting, because I think a lot of people don't know that non-citizens could ever vote in the United States. And the last state to ban their participation in elections was Arkansas. And the last state to ban property qualifications as a requirement for voting in 1856 was North Carolina. Okay, so let's invite our panelists onto the screen, and we are going to discuss the first question. Okay, so our first question is on the Diebold question, which is let's go with, okay, which of these is closest to the typical cost of a single Diebold AccuVote TS electronic voting machine? Michael, this was your question. So why don't you tell us why you asked it, and then explain to the folks who don't know what this beautiful machine even does.
I asked it because one of the central problems that I see right now in American elections is the age of voting equipment. A lot of jurisdictions haven't upgraded their stuff since the Help America Vote Act in 2002, after the disaster of the 2000 election. And I think, when you really start digging in here, the Brennan Center had a very nice report about this a few years back, where, they were talking about Windows XP being the most commonly used operating system on what is effectively 10 to 15-year-old laptops running American democracy. And so what I always do is ask my students, how many of you could get through this class with a 10-year-old computer? Because that's what our democracy is doing every 10 years or every 2 years. And I think the real barrier to that is cost. Now, $3,000, I think most people overshot it. When I looked at the answers, I think most people guessed higher. And so you might say, well, $3,000, maybe not so bad. But the city of Philadelphia alone has 800 precincts. And we know that, hopefully those precincts don't just have one machine in them. So when you start adding this up, you really run up the price tag. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to know what this stuff costs and what it does, so that we can know why the act of voting is sometimes less good than it ought to be or could be.
Yeah, and Maurice, I want you to jump in here because the age of America's voting machines has, you know, pretty clear security implications. So why don't you walk us through kind of what we're facing right now?
Certainly, one of the biggest challenges that Michael highlighted was the fact that we're just in a different age of security. You can't just put out software and expect it to run securely and meet all the needs of all the users for a decade plus. We're in an age now where you need to be able to deploy software updates, sometimes even several times a year. And if you have old software, sometimes the manufacturer isn't providing those kinds of updates, or the hardware is just not capable of staying up with the software that's needed to be secure and accessible. So not only are we in a situation where there are many states that are still using old machines, but it's difficult to try to plan out long-term strategies for replacing those machines because so much of the funding is dependent on state and local budgets. There's not a lot of consistent funding coming from Congress, and large capital outlays are something that are difficult for state and local governments to be able to commit to.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And yesterday we covered a pretty big ask by 300 state and local elections officials who have sent sort of a little package of letters to Congress asking them to spend $250 million over 10 years on election equipment. This would be the largest sort of consistent injection of funds into election equipment ever. So Paul, can you talk about what that money would mean for election officials who have been asking for consistent consideration for funding for quite a long time?
Absolutely, Jessica. I want to take a bit more optimistic tone than my good friend and colleague, Michael. The vendor market is an interesting market here. It's a strange market. There's lots of adjectives that they use to describe it. It's not really a market at all. There are very few players in the market. One of the questions I reviewed later on how many voting systems have passed the voluntary voting systems guidelines, and the correct answer was 0. So there is a whole set of regulatory layers that both jurisdictions and technology providers have to navigate. So these debolt machines for $3,000, as Michael pointed out, people guessed high. They likely are. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the technology side, but that doesn't mean these machines don't work. It just means, as Maurice pointed out, they're sort of slow moving in a way, and they're using older technology. So all of these technology providers have very close relationships with the states and the local jurisdictions, which is sort of what leads to these older technology being used. That money, Jessica, you asked, would be vital for jurisdictions to be able to adapt and adjust. We know, for example, in Oregon, a number of our local counties received infusions of cash because of the foundation grants that came out of the Zuckerberg Foundation and of the Schwarzenegger Institute. And some of them upgraded to a different way to process the vote by mail ballots using off-the-shelf hardware with some tailored specialized software. So that's one of the solutions that many local jurisdictions are looking at, where you can buy off-the-shelf equipment, but you still are going to need that specialized software. And Maurice, may speak to this now later, but you do need to set, there's some very strict guidelines that need to be met for anything that enters into the election space. And we know now, but the money absolutely is needed for all kinds of things, not just the technology, but just bringing these offices up to speed and allow them to be fully funded. We can't keep having democracy on the cheap.
I like that, democracy on the cheap. That's certainly what we've been trying to have. That's funny. Okay, quick announcement. If you are one of the 3 finalists, which again is, let me see here, we've got Dave from Washington, D.C., Spencer from New York, and Dale from Minnesota. If you could look for if you could message all panelists in the chat and just shoot your email over, because we're having some difficulty accessing them in the Google form. So just click all panelists so that not everybody gets your email. We promise to be responsible with it, and shoot us the best email for you that you can access right now, or in a few minutes anyway. Okay, great. Well, thank you guys so much. And we had a question in the chat that sort of asked, like, some of these old voting machines are like fine, right? Like they do a specific thing, and it doesn't matter if they're 10 years old or 15 years old. So what is the sort of net problem with having old technology? And I think we're probably talking not about like you know, an Inca vote, but like a Diebold voting machine that doesn't produce paper backups.
Inca
Right?
vote, by the way, for those who don't remember, was a stamp system that had been developed in Los Angeles County. And the reason Los Angeles County will often source their own machines, they have what, over 5 million, maybe 5.5 million voters now. So they actually have the market power to be able to get their own. You know, the problem, Jessica, is not so much the hardware as the maintenance. The issue here is you have vendor contracts for maintenance of this software that are getting old. Companies are changing hands very rapidly. The number of the companies that were in this space in the early 2000s, after the Help America Vote Act, are not in this space anymore. And so it's difficult, you know, it's difficult to make money in that space. So, you know, we're very American here, very capitalist. We want to privatize elections. We privatize them out to these companies, but it's hard to make money in this space. So, you know, the government's going to have to fund this in order to have high quality. But yeah, I think, and Michael, I noticed you now, Maurice may know better, but I think a lot of it's the ongoing maintenance is really the issue, not the hardware itself is the problem. It's just, you can't update Windows 2000 anymore. Shocking.
Shocking. And well, and it's so interesting for me. One of the most fascinating reporting trips that I did to a county elections office, which I see about 10 names of county elections officials I have personally visited in the participants panel here, so, or the participants log on Zoom, so people know that I've been out and about. But San Diego has what I can only describe as like a boneyard of voting machines, because the voting machines that they use, no one's producing like new hardware for, so they like have stacks and stacks of old machines so that they can like cannibalize parts from less good machines onto the good machines. Like, Maurice, like what problems do we run into if we do stuff like that?
That's just scary to me. That one, it's a logistical headache, but two, it also is a security concern because you're storing these old machines. So you need to make sure that they're being secured and monitored 24/7. But also the condition of the machines is going to be tough to keep up with. And lastly, machines that are that old are going to be researched at places like DEF CON Voting Village, at other research institutes. And so people are going to be finding vulnerabilities in these machines. So the longer they're in service, the more likely those security vulnerabilities are to be discovered, and they could be leveraged. And so without getting additional patching, whether it's by software or hardware means, it just means that those machines and ultimately the voters that should be trusting those machines are suspect.
Okay, great. And Paul has just piped in on the chat here and said that it is true that New York kept a small craft repair operation in place to repair the lever machines beyond their reasonable lifespan. Can you just talk about that quickly, and then we'll go on to the second question, Paul?
Yeah, there was a period of time. I mean, the sort of running joke in the community was that New York resisted some of the changes put in place after HAVA. They resisted successfully long enough that they sort of missed the whole direct recording electronic machine, and they jumped right up. So in a way that was good. But yeah, at the time, and I don't remember the stories, Jessica, but back then there was a small group of individuals who knew how to design the physical parts that were needed for the physical lever machines, and they would repair those machines. If something broke, somebody would come in and replace a flywheel or a gear. Someone from New York City is going to correct me on this, but yes, that was the case because they had so many out there and they relied on them, and it's such a big jurisdiction that they were able to keep this kind of repair operation going. I have a 64 Dart at home, and if anybody knows an auto mechanic for it, I'd love to look for one.
Well, I would cut in there, Paul, and say someone from New York is actually going to extend that, because that's exactly the same approach that's taken with the subway, is this little machine shop where they make parts from 1931. So I'm not surprised by that anecdote at all.
Well, that gives me so much faith in the function of my former home city. I don't live there anymore. Maybe I had good timing. Okay, we're going to move on. All right, so major voting rights laws passed. There's really only been one. Maurice, I think this was your question. Do you want to kind of offer some thoughts on why you asked this and why folks might be surprised by the result?
Yeah, so there tends to be this argument that somehow the federal government needs to stay out of elections, that's really just the purview of the states, and go back to thinking about why is it that if it is in fact the states that are running elections, should Congress even be involved? And Congress gets to be involved when it comes to federal elections, and they've done so quite a bit in the last 100 years. We've had at least 3 constitutional amendments in terms of voting rights. But then about once a decade, Congress decides that it really does need to tackle an issue. So we've had a string of civil rights acts that have been passed. We also have laws regarding accessibility, military and overseas voters. We've mentioned HAVA, the Help America Vote Act. That was the big cash infusion about 20 years ago after the hanging Chad debacle. And so it's not unusual for Congress to be involved. And I think it's happened enough that it shouldn't be a surprise, because what it really comes down to is that everyone is involved in our elections, from the local level to the state level to the federal level, because elections really are a team sport. And so no particular level of government should lay entire claim of having a responsibility over elections. It really comes down to what's the appropriate amount of responsibility that each level of government should have, and how can they best coordinate their limited resources? Because something that we've all heard is that there's certainly not enough money going into elections to keep them as up to date as we're actually having elections.
Okay, great. Michael, is there anything you want to add on this? I know that you and I have done events so far, like in the past, in which people are kind of like surprised that the federal government does this or that one state makes it harder to vote than another state. They probably didn't expect. So what misconceptions are wrapped up in the thinking around voting on the federal level that maybe you'd like to address?
Well, I mean, I think I see 2 pretty common ones, even though the language in the Constitution is exactly the way that it is, which is we generally expect states and counties and whatever, however you define a jurisdiction, to be semi-sovereign here, but Congress can step in, right? And Congress does step in, and we have seen that about every 10 to 15 years, and so I think the reason why people undershoot it is because these are, they're not, when they're passed, they're not these big, sexy, redistributive tax break kind of policies. People tend not to pay attention to voting and voting rights. It's changing some now as voting rights becomes more of a partisan issue, but historically people have paid much less attention, and the media has not covered these things as dynamically as maybe they ought to have. And I think that feeds a lot of public opinion. But something like the motor voter law, which has fundamentally changed the face of voter registration in this country, right, is one of these things that is part of this answer. And it's just so baked into our day-to-day experience as we go to the DMV that we don't even think about it anymore, even though it took Congress stepping in to proactively get people registered to do that. And so I think that's the motor voter law is one of my favorite examples of one of these sort of submerged major acts of Congress.
Okay, that makes sense. We've got about 5 minutes, so I want to switch to our last question so that we can briefly discuss other questions. But the question that stumped most people was which state was the last to ban non-citizen voting. So Arkansas, surprisingly, the state that contains most of my family lineage. I don't know what that says about me. I love Arkansas. It's beautiful. It was Arkansas in 1926. And I think that most people are pretty surprised to know that non-citizens ever did vote legally in the United States in any capacity. Certainly they did. Actually, they voted legally in essentially every state for at least a little while. And the federal government used non-citizen voting to induce immigrants moving to new territories in early American history, before then later disenfranchising them. So the ebb and flow of voting rights rolls on. Paul, I want to bring you in here a little bit. Do you, in your courses, do you talk about non-citizen participation in U.S. elections? Does the 1926 date for Arkansas surprise you, or is it sort of like an underappreciated fact of American history that non-citizens weren't as, pushed away as they once were?
Well, Jessica, my Zoom room is not as well curated as yours, of course, or Michael's. I don't know what that is, but I happen to have the second book in my stack here is Alex Kazar's wonderful book called The Right to Vote.
It is a great book. I so recommend it. Will you just hold it up? Because this is not He is not a sponsor of this event.
Absolutely a wonderful book. I know it looks
This is
long,
critical
and
reading.
you see I teach on it. Jessica, the example that I use a lot in class actually is New Jersey was the last state to have women, where women had the right to vote until I believe 1804, when that was removed. And then Wyoming was the state that brought back women right to vote in 1870 something. Let me look it up in there. So yeah, there's been a lot of variations in this. The reason I love Kezar's book is because he walks through just in a very compelling way the history of voting rights in the United States. And the quick version of this book is that there's been a linear trend toward more individuals having the ability to vote, but that trend has not been steady. It ebbs and flows, and it ebbs and flows primarily by party competition. Right now, the two parties are competing over voters. And some, one party is competing to, I think, restrict people's access to the ballot box. The other party is competing to add people to the ballot box. I wish that wasn't a partisan competition, but that has been our history. So yeah, that's not the fact that I yank out, but I think it is important for people to understand the kind of variability and sort of the trends over time in the country. Again, Kezar is a great book, and yeah, I probably would have missed that one, by the way.
All right, last little bit, Michael. I know that you and I have discussed this in the past, but I just wonder if the non-citizen participation question is sort of popping up again just randomly in little municipal areas that maybe in the last 5 years have decided, if you're a permanent non-citizen, maybe you should participate in our local elections. And I feel like this happens a lot around like university areas that have high proportions of non-citizens living there to access the university's resources. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, do you think that we'll see a trend here? I don't know of one that's like common, but I have seen it pop up a little bit here and there.
Well, I think we've seen it a bit in Maryland. We've seen it in San Francisco, where, and the intuition here is you may not be citizens, but you have kids in school. And so you have a fundamental interest in, say, a school board election, which is not tied. You have a stake there, and it's not tied to citizenship. And so we've seen these jurisdictions pass laws specific to these local elections out of that philosophy. You need not be a citizen to have a stake in our community. And I think you probably will see this expand some. I don't think it's going to be a tidal wave, but wouldn't surprise me if there was more of this 10 years from now than there is today.
Okay, great. And I mean, it's so interesting to me that this was once like a very common thing. I think that when I have shared this fact with folks, they're like, it shocks me that non-citizens were ever allowed to vote in the United States. Do you guys have any thoughts about like the changing sort of understanding of like who is American and who gets to vote based on this sort of odd historical little fact? Anybody can jump in.
I think one thing is clear is that elections and voting are far more interesting than I think the average person gives it credit for. We're seeing lots of change. Something that I've heard in the past is that, we should just go back to fill in the blank time period, and that's how we should vote. There's never really been a time in the history of America where voting has just been a calm, sort of boring thing. There's been lots of interesting laws, passing for good and for bad. And so I think it's important to remember that when we want to be, America and individual states can be very flexible in terms of making sure that we're enabling people to vote and doing what we can to ensure that everyone has access to the ballots.
Okay, great.
But
all right, guys. Yes, go ahead,
just
Michael.
real quick.
Yeah.
That is a two-edged coin, and that's what we need to be on guard with, because that flexibility, it can be used to disenfranchise people as well, and has probably been used to do that more frequently. And so that patchwork and the ability of jurisdictions to chart the course here, particularly with the gutted Voting Rights Act, is what I see as a particular danger of the present moment.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you for that addition. All right. So it is now time for us to move to the lightning round. So if you are one of the 3 finalists, please check your email. We will get the countdown clock started shortly, and I will announce the winners. And for now, I would also like to invite Allison Go from Chalkbeat to talk a little bit about Votebeat and our goals, to keep you entertained for the couple of minutes that the lightning round will be on. The lightning round people, you have 2 minutes to answer 5 questions, so get your hustle on.
Amazing. And I timed this. It's like 1 minute and 53 seconds. So you might get 7 seconds less, depending on how fast I talk. So as Jessica said, my name is Allison Go. I'm the co-founder of Votebeat and the chief strategy officer at Chalkbeat, the parent company of Votebeat. So first I wanted to give a little background about Votebeat. So we are a nonprofit newsroom covering local election administration and voting. Votebeat was actually created in the fall of last year, in the middle of a historic election, as we all know, which was in the middle of a raging pandemic. Truly historic times. It was a time when the process of voting itself was undergoing rapid and dramatic change, and when the scrutiny and conversation about the election itself and election administration was perhaps bigger than it has ever been in the history of modern voting. At the time, we created Votebeat as a pop-up or as an experiment to journalistically meet the moment. But what I think we learned, and what all of us election nerds here today know, is that the story didn't actually end on election day, or even the month after, or 6 months after. It's still going on right now. And so for the last several months, we've been working with Jessica and a small team to continue the work of reporting and informing on this critical topic. Our plan is to grow. In particular, we want to be placing more local reporters on the ground where the action is happening. So on our list to go to, Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Michigan, so on. So all the states that are likely already in your newsfeed, those are the places we want to go and put people on the ground talking to election administrators, to the legislators there, and informing the public and debunking the disinformation and misinformation that is happening. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Votebeat is a nonprofit, and we need, like all nonprofits, we need your support and the support of the community to continue to grow and to continue to do this work. So here's the ask. If you can, please donate to Votebeat. You can do this on our site or via the emails that we'll be sending to you after this event. 2, if you know others who would be interested in this work, please spread the word. We're always so grateful for new readers, for intros, for new ideas. Now that's it for the business part of the event. You know it's the business part because I'm wearing a blazer. So thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that was exactly 2 minutes, but I'm not exactly sure. So I'll kind of slow down my talking. But I do want to kick it back to Jessica so she can then let us know the results of the lightning round.
Hi there. Yes, the sun is now killing me. So I'm moving over. Everybody, the winner of our fabulous event is Dave from Washington, D.C. Congratulations, Dave. But good news is that all 3 participants in the lightning round are getting the pillow. I just really wanted to have a winner. So now we have one. But you all win a pillow. Congratulations on the pillow. Here, it is an excellent pillow. So I may avail myself of one as well, so that I can sleep more soundly at night knowing that I know so much about voting, which is what I hope the 3 of you will be doing. Thank you guys so much for participating today. I hope that you will keep coming to Votebeat events. We're going to have more of them. They may not be game shows, but they will be equally as fun. And I would also, I'm going to pop this link in the chat right now. I hope that you guys will subscribe to our newsletter. We have a weekly newsletter that comes out every Saturday. This week, our featured hobbyist, which we do every week with an election official or election expert, was Paul, who is a prolific gardener. Next week, it is going to be Maurice, and I will let you guys figure out what his truly fascinating hobby is when you check your email next week. So again, please sign up for our newsletter. It is very fun. The subscription URL is now in the chat. If you guys have any questions or you are interested in getting a copy of the quiz, please send me an email. That is also in the chat as well. Thanks everyone. This was so fun. I appreciate you joining us today.